The handcuffs clicked shut, but the old veteran didn't flinch. In the courtroom, whispers and muffled laughs filled the air. They saw a broken old man, frail and defeated, another ghost of a forgotten war. They saw his hands trembling on the defendant's table. What they didn't see were those same hands, steady as granite, holding a rifle that once ended a war with a single, impossible shot. And what no one in that room could possibly know was that the only other witness to that shot wasn't on the docket. He was on a jet, 4 stars gleaming on his shoulder, descending from the clouds to settle a debt of honor. The whispers followed him, clinging to him like the damp morning air as he was led into the sterile fluorescent glare of the county courthouse. "That's him," a woman muttered to her friend, her voice dripping with morbid curiosity. "The one who attacked the Miller boy. I heard he was special forces or something." Probably snapped. They saw a broken relic, a forgotten soldier whose private war had finally spilled out into their peaceful town. But what they failed to understand, what the arrogant young prosecutor and the overworked public defender could never possibly guess, was that the man in chains before them hadn't snapped. He was holding back. He was containing a lifetime of controlled violence with a force of will that could shatter mountains. They didn't know that his silence wasn't the admission of guilt, but the heavy burden of honor, and they certainly had no idea that the one man on earth who knew the truth, the man whose life was the living proof of Elias's heroism, was at that very moment stepping onto a private jet with a single destination programmed into its navigation system, Oak Haven, his mission to save his shepherd. Welcome to NX Incredible Stories. Before we uncover the shocking truth behind one man's silence, we'd be honored to know which city you're watching from today. Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that a hero's honor is worth fighting for, hit that subscribe button to join our mission. We're grateful to have you with us. The story that had landed Elias Vance in cuffs was simple, brutal, and a masterfully constructed lie. It began 2 nights earlier in the shadows of an alley behind a local tavern. Elias was on his nightly walk, a ritual of measured steps that helped quiet the roaring in his head when he saw it. A scene as old as time. 2 figures, one large and aggressive, the other smaller, cornered. The larger figure, a young man named Kevin Miller, the arrogant son of the wealthiest contractor in the county, was shoving a terrified teenager against a brick wall, demanding his wallet. It was a cheap, ugly display of power. Elias didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply changed his trajectory. His shuffling, tired steps became silent, deliberate, and purposeful. The tremor that usually rattled his hands vanished, replaced by an unnerving, absolute stillness. He emerged from the shadows like a wraith, and his voice, a low gravel that seemed to cut through the night air, said just one word: enough. Kevin Miller, drunk on cheap beer and the invincibility of his family name, laughed. "Get lost, old man. This ain't your business." Elias took another step. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't make a threat. He just looked at Kevin, and in that gaze, the boy's world tilted on its axis. It was a look devoid of anger, devoid of fear. It was the calm, assessing gaze of a man who had stared into the very heart of human darkness and was utterly unimpressed by this pathetic, schoolyard imitation. Kevin saw an abyss in those eyes, a depth of experience that terrified him. He shoved the teenager aside and stumbled backward. He ran. The next day, that fear had been twisted into a weapon. Kevin Miller, flanked by his father's high-priced lawyer, filed a police report. He spun a tale of an unhinged old veteran who had assaulted him without provocation, screaming about his time in the war, threatening to kill him. The teenager who was being mugged, his family dependent on a Miller construction contract, was paid to stay silent. In a town where the Miller name was a shield, the word of a reclusive old veteran was less than dust. The arrest was swift. The charge was aggravated assault. The outcome seemed inevitable. Now in the courtroom, Elias sat alone, an island of silence in a sea of judgment. His public defender, a young woman named Sarah with weary eyes that had seen too many lost causes, had tried to reason with him. "Mr. Vance," she'd said, her voice a plea. "We can argue temporary insanity, maybe get you into a VA program. It's the only way. But you have to talk to me. You have to give me something." Elias had just shaken his head, the tremor returning to his hands as the adrenaline faded, leaving behind the familiar, rattling exhaustion. He would not dishonor the men he fought beside by pleading insanity. He would not use their war, his war, as an excuse. He had fought for his country. He would not fight this. This was just noise. The prosecutor, a young man named Peterson with a sharp suit and an even sharper ambition, saw an open and shut case. He paraded Kevin Miller to the stand, the boy's face a perfect mask of practiced fear. Kevin told his story, his voice trembling as he embellished it with details of Elias's crazed eyes and violent threats. He claimed Elias had lifted him off the ground, a feat that would have been impossible for a man of Elias's apparent frailty. But the jury didn't see frailty. They saw the legend they'd built in their own minds, the dangerous, unpredictable vet. This man, Peterson declared, his voice ringing with false righteousness as he pointed a finger at Elias, is a relic of a bygone era who believes his past service gives him a license for violence. He is not a hero. He is a menace to this community, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Elias didn't react. He just stared at a small crack in the courtroom floor, his mind 1,000 miles and a decade away. He was thinking of the searing dust of the Sangjin Valley, of the faces of the young Marines he'd served with, of the promises they'd made to one another in the dark before a mission. He had been a shepherd to them, his rifle a crook that guided them through hell. He had brought every single one of his men home from that last patrol, all except the ones he'd had to carry. Sarah, his defender, gave a half-hearted cross-examination. She had nothing to work with. No witnesses, no alibi, only the stubborn, unbreakable silence of her client. The jury's faces were set, their minds already made up. The case seemed over before it had truly begun. But what no one in that room knew, what no one could possibly comprehend, was that this was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of the first act. The forces of injustice had played their hand. Now, the forces of honor were about to answer. Hundreds of miles away, a single phone call from a persistent local journalist had broken through the noise. It had reached a man who owed Elias Vance more than a debt. He owed him his life, and that man, Sergeant Major Marcus Thorne, was already on his way. He wasn't coming to ask for justice. He was coming to demand it. The ghost of Oakhaven was about to have his honor defended by the very man he once carried from the gates of hell. The real trial was just beginning. The prosecution rested its case with a smug finality. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, settled like dust on old furniture. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, as the judge called for a brief recess before the defense's closing statement, a statement everyone knew would be brief and ineffective. Elias Vance remained a statue of silent resignation. He was a man adrift in a sea of judgment, and he had long since stopped trying to swim. But far above the quiet murmur of the Oakhaven courthouse, another kind of storm was gathering. On a Gulfstream G550 cutting through the stratosphere, Marcus Thorne stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the endless expanse of blue. He was seeing the searing, sun-bleached landscape of Afghanistan's Helmand province. In his hand, he held an iPad displaying a grainy photo of Elias being led away in handcuffs. The image had been sent to him less than an hour ago by his chief of staff, forwarded from a determined young reporter who had refused to let the story die. The reporter, a woman named Jessica Riley, had been the only person in Oakhaven who felt a flicker of doubt. Something about Elias's stoic silence didn't feel like guilt. It felt like control. She had dug into his military records, most of which were sealed, but she found one small, unredacted detail. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the Dark Horse Battalion, a unit legendary for its brutal deployment in the Sangjin Valley, a place known as the Heart of Darkness for the Marine Corps. Her inquiry sent to a Veterans Affairs contact had tripped a silent wire, an informal network set up by veterans of the most intense conflicts to look out for their own. The email found its way up a chain of command built not on rank, but on shared blood and sacrifice. It landed in the inbox of Marcus Thorne, now a respected state senator, a man whose political career was built on a foundation of unwavering integrity. Thorne had seen the name Elias Vance, and the world had stopped. He canceled a meeting with the governor. He told his pilot to file a new flight plan. Oakhaven, immediately. Now, at 30,000 feet, the memories came unbidden, as sharp and clear as the day they were forged in fire. Sangjin, 2010. He was Lieutenant Thorne then, a fresh-faced officer leading a platoon into a hornet's nest. They were on a routine patrol when the world exploded. An IED tore through their lead vehicle. The ambush was perfectly coordinated. RPGs and machine gun fire rained down from the rooftops. They were pinned down, cut off, bleeding in the dust. Thorne remembered the terror, the feeling of utter helplessness as 2 of his men went down. He remembered trying to rally his remaining squad when a sniper's bullet tore through his shoulder, slamming him against a wall. The world began to gray out. He was dying. His men were dying. It was over. And then, through the chaos came a voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the din of battle like a surgeon's scalpel. "Lieutenant, stay with me." "On your feet, sir." It was Sergeant Elias Vance, his platoon's designated marksman, a man they called Shepherd. Vance wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be providing overwatch from a distant rooftop, but when the comms went down and the ambush was sprung, he had abandoned his sniper's perch. He had broken protocol. He had run toward the kill zone. Thorne watched, dazed, as Vance became the calm center of the storm. The tremor that now defined Elias's hands was nowhere to be seen. His hands were a blur of deadly efficiency. He applied a tourniquet to Thorne's shoulder with one hand while firing his service rifle with the other. He directed fire, calling out enemy positions with an almost supernatural awareness of the battlefield. He orchestrated a fighting retreat, pulling his scattered men together, creating order from chaos. He shouted into his radio, not calling for rescue, but for retribution. "Danger close!" he'd roared, giving coordinates for an artillery strike so near their own position that it was borderline suicidal. But it was the only move they had. The shells screamed in, landing with pinpoint accuracy, turning the enemy's ambush into a tomb. The battle wasn't over. They still had to get out. Thorne couldn't walk. Elias didn't hesitate. He hoisted his wounded lieutenant, all 190 pounds of him, onto his back and began to move. He carried him for nearly a mile under sporadic fire, back to the relative safety of their forward operating base. The entire time, with a man bleeding out on his back, Elias never stopped fighting, never stopped leading. He was, in every sense of the word, their shepherd. He had refused to lose a single man to the wolves. The jet's engines whined as it began its descent, pulling Marcus Thorne from the vivid hell of his memory. He looked at the photo of Elias again. He saw the quiet resignation in his old friend's eyes and felt a hot surge of anger, not at Elias, but at the world that had done this to him. The world that could look at a man who had single-handedly saved a dozen lives and see nothing but a broken-down old vet. The bond between soldiers is forged in fire, a loyalty most of us can only imagine. Have you ever known a friendship so strong that distance and time could never break it? Tell us about that person in the comments below. We believe those bonds are the true fabric of our nation. As the car carrying him from the private airfield sped toward the courthouse, Thorne felt a grim resolve settle over him. He wasn't just coming to testify, he was coming to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. He was coming to remind a sleeping town what a real American hero looked like. He stepped out of the car, his posture ramrod straight, his eyes scanning the building, not with curiosity, but with the grim determination of a man coming to correct a grave injustice. He wasn't wearing a uniform decorated with medals. His suit was quiet, his expression was thunderous. He didn't come as a politician, he came as a brother. And he was about to bring the thunder of the Sangan Valley into that quiet little courtroom. The moment Marcus Thorne pushed through the double doors, the courtroom's drowsy atmosphere shattered. It wasn't his expensive suit or the confident stride of a man used to commanding respect. It was the sheer force of his presence. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor, Peterson, mid-sentence in his patronizing cross-examination of a minor witness, faltered and stopped. The judge, a woman named Carol Hines, looked up from her notes, her expression shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to stunned recognition. "Senator Thorne?" she asked, her voice betraying her shock. She knew him from state functions, a powerful and universally respected figure. "What on earth brings you to Oakhaven?" Thorne didn't answer her directly. His eyes swept the room, taking in the biased jury, the smirking prosecutor, the indifferent bailiffs, and finally landing on the solitary figure at the defense table. Elias Vance slowly lifted his head. For the first time that day, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Not relief, not surprise, but a deep, profound weariness. He gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, a silent plea for Thorne to turn around and leave him to his fate. Thorne ignored it. He walked down the center aisle, his polished shoes echoing on the linoleum floor. He didn't stop at the prosecutor's table. He didn't stop at the witness stand. He walked directly to the defense table and stood behind Elias, placing a firm, steady hand on his friend's shoulder. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," Thorne said, his voice calm but ringing with an authority that silenced the room. "But I was just made aware of these proceedings. I am here to speak on behalf of Sergeant Elias Vance." The prosecutor Peterson finally found his voice. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. Senator Thorne is not on any witness list." Judge Hines looked from the powerful senator to the silent man in the defendant's chair. She was a judge in a small town, but she knew a pivotal moment when she saw one. This was no longer a simple assault case. "Overruled, Mr. Peterson," she said, her tone sharp. "The court will hear what the senator has to say. Please approach the bench, Senator." Thorne gave Elias's shoulder a final reassuring squeeze before turning to face the judge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every person in that room, from the jury to the reporters in the back, leaned forward, straining to hear. "Your Honor," Thorne began, "I've read the charges against this man. I've heard the accusations. And I am here to tell you that you are not trying a criminal. You are judging a man whose capacity for restraint is greater than anyone in this room can possibly comprehend." He turned slightly, addressing the jury directly. "Mr. Peterson calls him a ticking time bomb. I call him a hero. You see a man with shaking hands and a quiet demeanor, and you assume weakness or guilt. You want to know why his hands shake? Let me tell you about the Sangin Valley, a place where the life expectancy of a Marine was measured in minutes." Thorne's voice dropped, becoming intensely personal, drawing everyone into the memory. He told them everything. He described the IED, the ambush, the feeling of his own life bleeding out into the Afghan dust. He described the chaos, the screams, the certainty of death. And then he described the shepherd. He told them how Elias Vance, a sniper trained for calm, methodical distance, had charged into the heart of the fire. He painted a picture of Elias moving through the storm, a rock of stability, his hands steady as a surgeon's as he patched up the wounded, directed fire, and single-handedly turned the tide of a lost battle. He called in an artillery strike so close to our own position that the shrapnel was kicking dirt in our faces, Thorne said, his voice raw with the memory. The brass wanted to court-martial him for it, but the men on the ground wanted to give him a medal. He saved 12 lives that day, mine included. He carried me on his back through a river of fire. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. So yes, his hands shake now. They shake because he bore a weight that day that would have crushed a lesser man. They shake because he is still carrying the ghosts of men who weren't as lucky. His silence isn't arrogance or guilt. It is the quiet dignity of a man who has seen too much, done too much, and sacrificed too much to be bothered by trivial accusations in a quiet town that has no idea what real danger looks like. He took a step closer to the defense table, his eyes locked on Elias. And then, in a gesture that ripped the breath from everyone in the room, Senator Marcus Thorne, a man who commanded the respect of governors and generals, slowly, deliberately, knelt on one knee before the quiet old man in the defendant's chair. He didn't bow his head. He looked right at Elias, his eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude and rage. "I'm sorry, Shep," he said, his voice just for Elias, but it carried through the stunned silence. "I'm sorry we let it come to this. I'm sorry this world forgot." It was an apology not for a crime, but for a failure of memory. An apology for every time someone had looked at Elias Vance and seen a ghost instead of a hero. The sound of the gavel falling seemed distant, an afterthought. The judge's voice, thick with emotion, dismissed all charges. The chains came off, but the real weight, the one Elias had carried for years, was only just beginning to lift. The law had rendered its verdict, but it was honor that had won the day. The clatter of the handcuffs falling onto the defense table echoed in the silent courtroom, a sound of liberation that felt as loud as a cannon shot. For a long moment, no one moved. The deputies, who had once handled Elias Vance with a detached professional contempt, now found themselves unable to meet his gaze, their faces flushed with a sudden hot shame. The jury, who had been mere moments from convicting an innocent man, stared at their own hands on the polished wood of the jury box as if seeing them for the first time. Prosecutor Peterson, his face pale and his ambitions shattered, quietly packed his briefcase, his smug certainty replaced by the hollow weight of a truth he could not prosecute and could not ignore. Elias Vance stood a free man, though the concept felt alien after a lifetime of confinement in the prison of his own past. He looked at Marcus Thorne, who had risen to his feet, and for the first time that day, a small, weary smile touched Elias's lips. It was a fragile thing, like a crack of light in a dark, forgotten room. "You're late, Sergeant Major," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that held no accusation, only the deep familiarity of a shared history. Thorne chuckled, a sound of pure relief that broke the spell in the courtroom. "You were always a tough man to keep up with, Shepard." They didn't embrace. They didn't need to. In that shared glance, a decade of distance and a world of pain were bridged. They simply stood together, two pillars of a forgotten war, as the room slowly came back to life around them. Sarah, the young public defender, approached them, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and professional regret. "Mr. Vance, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." "You did your job, counselor," Elias said, a gesture of grace that she didn't deserve but desperately needed. It was his first act as a free man, to grant absolution. As they walked down the center aisle, the gallery parted for them like the Red Sea. The reporters, who had been so eager to capture the image of a fallen veteran, now held their cameras down, their questions dying on their lips. What could they possibly ask? How do you ask a man to describe the hell he walked through to save his friends? How do you ask a hero why he chose to suffer in silence? Outside, the harsh sunlight seemed brighter, less judgmental. The town of Oakhaven was still there, but something fundamental had shifted in its soul. It had been forced to look in the mirror, and it did not like what it had seen. The truth, once unleashed, spread through the small town like wildfire. The story of the decorated senator kneeling to the town recluse was on every local news channel, a modern parable of honor and neglect. The Miller family, architects of the lie, found themselves pariahs in the town they once owned. Their wealth was no longer a shield. It was a spotlight on their disgrace. They left town for an extended vacation from which no one expected them to return. The young teenager who had been the real victim of the alleyway mugging, his conscience finally louder than his fear, came forward with his parents and told the police the true story. The legal record was now as clean as Elias's honor had always been. Later that afternoon, Elias sat in the same worn booth at the corner diner. Marcus sat opposite him. The young waitress approached their table, her hands shaking far more than Elias's ever had. She placed a cup of fresh coffee and a large slice of apple pie in front of him. "This is on the house, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "All of it. Forever." He looked up, and this time he truly met her eyes. He saw not pity, but a profound newfound respect. He offered a simple nod, but it was a bridge. A small sturdy bridge back to a world that had, for so long, kept him on the other side. Marcus watched the exchange, then leaned forward. He had canceled his flight back. Some duties transcended politics and schedules. "You know, Shep," he said softly, his voice careful. "There are programs, good ones. I have connections, people who can help with—" He trailed off, unable to bring himself to say the clinical, inadequate word trauma. Elias took a slow sip of coffee, his hands wrapped around the warm mug. The tremor was still there, a loyal, unwanted companion. "I know, Marcus," he said, his gaze distant for a moment. "The shaking. It's the price. It's the cost of being steady when it counted. I made my peace with it a long time ago." "You shouldn't have to carry it alone," Marcus insisted, his voice hardening with a protective edge. "You carried all of us. It's our turn now. Let someone else carry you for a while." And that was the heart of it. The lesson forged in that quiet diner, far from any battlefield. It was the silent covenant between those who fight and those who are protected. A hero's duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. In fact, that's when their hardest battle often begins. The fight against being forgotten. the fight against the apathy of a world that moves on too quickly. Elias Vance's shaking hands were not a sign of weakness. They were a testament. They were the physical echo of a soul that refused to break while holding the line for others. They were the price he paid for our peace, the receipt for a debt we can never truly repay. And that is the lesson we must carry from Oak Haven today. Look around you. In your town, in your neighborhood, at the corner coffee shop, a shepherd walks among you. He may not look like a hero from the movies. He might be the quiet man at the end of the bar, the neighbor who keeps to himself, the old man with a tremor in his hands and a lifetime of thunder in his eyes. Do not wait for a senator to arrive to tell you who he is. Do not wait for a courtroom to reveal his honor. You be the one who remembers. You be the one who sees past the scars to the sacrifice. A simple thank you for your service. A cup of coffee offered without pity. A moment of genuine acknowledgement. These are the medals we can still award. These are the honors that matter most, because a nation is not ultimately defined by the wars it fights, but by how it treats its warriors when they come home. Elias took a slow bite of the pie. He looked at his oldest friend, the man who had flown across the country to stand by his side. Then he looked out the diner window at the quiet street of a town that was finally beginning to see him. "This is good pie," Elias said. And in that simple sentence, Marcus Thorne heard everything he needed to. He heard acceptance. He heard a flicker of peace. He heard the dawn finally breaking on a long, dark, and lonely night. The shepherd had come home. Let's make sure they all do. Elias Vance's story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often in plain sight, carrying battles we can't see. If you believe their stories need to be told and their honor defended, support our channel by hitting that subscribe button and sharing this video. Your voice helps us build a community of remembrance and respect. Thank you for listening and for never forgetting. We'll see you in the next one.